It's August in Texas, which means it's miserably hot, but there's so much more to it than that. We're going to take a look at an increasingly popular way to better assess heat stress. Plus, we'll address the always controversial leave something important in the backseat of your car so you don't forget your kid discussion, where I'm hoping to shatter your worldview on that topic. I'm meteorologist Matt Stolley at the Weather Service in Fort Worth, and we are on air. I've got good news. The pilot got picked up. We are back. It is episode 2, and we are not canceled just yet. It is Monday, August 19th, 2024. I hope your week is off to a good start, despite the fact that we're in the midst of some of the hottest weather so far this year. It's been, triple digits for past few days and probably will be for several more coming up. We'll talk more about that coming up later on in the episode for kind of what to expect for the rest of August. We do not have a weather spotlight guest today because my planned guest is actually out and deployed for the exact reason that we were going to have him on to chat about. So I'll just kind of leave that there as a teaser for the next episode, and I'm sure once he's back, we will have plenty to chat about for a future episode coming up. So today we've got heat to talk about, we've got drought to talk about, and while those topics might sound a little dry, huh? Dry? We have some not really new, but increasingly popular ways to assess heat stress that we'll be taking a look at here in just a few minutes. But for now, let's go ahead and just take a look at what the summer has had in store for us so far. And wow, what can you say about July? Those last couple of weeks of July were just, it's as good as you can ask for that time of year, to be honest. These were DFW's observed high temperatures for the course of the past month and a half, and the color coding corresponds to either above or below normal. So the entire last 2 weeks of July, we had highs that were below normal. Several days only reached the 80s. You just can't ask for anything better than that in late July. Some of the contributing factors for that, of course, we had the remnants of Hurricane Beryl move on shore. That brought us a few days of at least extra cloud cover, and some of our southeast areas did pick up some actual decent rainfall totals out of that too. And we also even had a decent cold front come down into North Texas. It stalled out for a few days. That brought us more cloud cover and some rain chances too. That's really hard to do this time of year, to get an actual noticeable cold front all the way this far south and then have it linger and contribute to storm chances for the span of a few days. And we managed to do both of those things during those 2 weeks of July. So that was a really nice break in the heat as we headed into August. Now, August, on the other hand, complete reversal of fortune. It's been 100 degrees for most of the month so far for afternoon highs. Has been for the past few days, and looks like it will be for several more yet. So we've got a long ways to go. Now, last time we had Daniel on, and we talked about how that late spring rainfall might help keep us maybe a little bit more mild during the first part of summer. And I think that held true really well for us over these past several weeks. Between June and July combined, we only had 8 days that reached or exceeded 100 degrees. And compared to last year in 2023, we had already had 23 in those 2 months. So we are running well behind pace of last year. Fortunately, last year to date, we had 37 days already where we reached 100 degrees. This year, we're sitting at half of that. So while we will still exceed our annual average of 20, because we're going to pick up a few more just this week alone and probably more through the rest of the month and maybe even early September too. We'll have to see what September holds for us. Usually, you can still pick up at least a few more 100-degree days early in the month before you start to get those stronger early fall cold fronts down into the plains. So, either way, I'm happy that we aren't on pace for 55 like we hit last year, and we'll just kind of have to see what these next few weeks have in store for us. So, in terms of rainfall, most of the rain so far over the past 60 days, anyway, this summer has been across southeast and east Texas. A lot of that was the result of the remnants of Beryl moving on shore on the Gulf and then tracking into parts of Louisiana, Arkansas. And some parts of southeast Texas saw between 10 and 20 inches of rain out of that. For our forecast area, a lot of those totals were below 10 inches. Some only saw a few inches of rain out of that particular storm, plus more later on in the presence of that front. But still, for the past 60 days, some southeastern portions of our forecast area have seen between 6 and 8 inches of rain, which is not too shabby at all for summer. You can't really ask for much better than that. Now, northwest Texas, on the other hand, from roughly from the Metroplex off to the northwest, most of those areas have only seen maybe about 1 to 3 inches of rain on average, and in some cases, even less than that. I know up at my house, I live on the northwest side of the Metroplex, and I think I've gotten between half an inch and 1 inch of rain over the course of the past 60 days, and the yard is feeling it for sure. So, parts of northwest Texas and then into the big country that haven't even had hardly an inch of rain are definitely feeling the effects of that. We've seen an uptick in wildfire activity, and that's probably just going to continue for the next few weeks without any additional widespread rain chances coming up in forecast over the course of these next few weeks. So it's not that surprising that we've seen drought conditions creep back in to most of northwest Texas and the big country. Those very high rainfall totals across the southeast have, of course, kept the drought monitor completely clear. But for northwest Texas and the big country, you'll remember that from the last episode that we had just a few weeks back, the drought monitor was completely clear for our entire forecast area in North Texas. And we've jumped up 2 categories in that time frame to either abnormally dry or moderate drought conditions now. And again, without more appreciable rainfall on the way, I would just expect these conditions to continue to expand and probably worsen over the course of the next few weeks. Now, this was pretty fast onset drought, sometimes referred to as a flash drought. That's pretty typical during the summer because it does not take long for triple-digit temperatures on a daily basis to start evaporating all the soil moisture and lead to really increased evapotranspiration from vegetation. So, drought can be very quickly onset in the course of just a few weeks during the peak heat times of year in the summer. So drought is often something that we think of on a much bigger picture scale, like over the course of months or even years. But in situations like this, it does not take long for drought conditions to creep in and worsen. Now, fortunately, our lakes are still in really good shape. Most of those are still 95 to 100% full. So we still have plenty of rain and water storage from the exceptionally wet spring that we had earlier in the year. So, with that, drought has also come heat. While heat might not be the most exciting weather element to talk about, it is year after year the leader in weather-related fatalities. Last year, it more than doubled up on any other weather-related hazard for the number of fatalities that were caused. So, over 200 heat-related deaths last year in 2023, and the averages are just far and away more than any other weather hazard. And those are a combination of factors. Could be that some people do not have access to AC during the hottest time of the year. It could be athletes that are overexerted during the peak heating of the day, or it could be children being left in hot vehicles. Those and more, all sorts of different reasons that heat is a leading weather related hazard in terms of fatalities. So every year, this Check the Back Seat campaign gets a lot of attention so that you do not leave a child in the back seat of a vehicle. And unfortunately, this often gets misconstrued into things that just kind of totally miss the point of this whole discussion. So the main piece of advice is usually that you leave something important in the back seat of your car so that you don't forget that your child is in the vehicle with you. And this gets taken totally out of context, especially in the online community. about how that must mean that you don't think that your kid is important, or that your purse or your cell phone is more important than your kid is, or any of this other sort of nonsense. And it totally misses the point of how these types of tragedies unfold. A lot of times this is happening to good people, to good parents, and it's not that they don't think that their kid is important. That's not the issue here. And I want to take just a couple minutes today to kind of address that with an example. So let's consider the following situation. Normally, your spouse takes the kiddo to daycare every single day of the work week. It's right by their place of work. It's on the way, just a couple minutes out of the way. So they're the one that's tasked with doing that every single day. Now, this time, they're out of town for on a business trip, and it's your turn to take the kiddo to daycare this morning. Now, last night was absolutely miserable. They had a bad dream and woke you up 3 different times in the middle of the night. Collectively, you might have pieced together maybe like 4 hours of sleep at best. The kiddo's tired because they didn't sleep either, obviously. So they're grouchy. The alarm goes off. You're trying to get them ready, get them something to eat for breakfast, and get them dressed, ready to go. But they're just fighting you every step of the way, and it's taking you just forever. It's just been one of those mornings. So finally, you get yourself ready, you get the kiddo ready, and you get him out to the car, strapped into the back seat, and you sit down in the driver's seat. Realize you don't even have your keys; they're still inside on the kitchen counter. You run back in, get your keys, pull out your cell phone to give the traffic one last check, and it's just solid red. There's an accident on the freeway. By the best of circumstances, if you left right now, you might be able to get to work on time at 9 a.m., which is right when a meeting starts. By the way, you don't want to be late to work today because a couple days ago you walked in a few minutes late because of traffic, and your boss made some snide remark about how you need to show up on time, even though you're always on time every other day of the year. So the last thing that you want to do is show up late again here just a couple days after that happened. So pull out of the driveway, undergo a grueling morning commute through all this traffic. Pull into the work parking lot. It's 8:59. You grab your things out of the front seat, sprint into that conference room for your 9 o'clock meeting, and you're there just in the nick of time as it's getting started. Well, 3 hours go by. Finally, break for lunch at noon, and you just can't help but think that you've forgotten something today. And then it hits you, and you sprint outside, but it's too late because the temperature of your vehicle has reached an uninhabitable 130 degrees in the afternoon or midday Texas sun. Now, that's how a good person falls victim to a tragedy. It's a sequence of all of these events that compile on one another, and it inevitably it leads to a tragedy. A tragedy is rarely a standalone occurrence. It's always a sequence of events or failures that occur. And think about all of these components that went into this. Extra stress at work, of the morning commute, an abnormal routine, a lack of sleep. I think we often underestimate what those things can do to the human mind and your decision making and your focus. And these aren't bad people that this happens to. These are great parents that this can happen to, that are in an unusual situation, that are subject to extra stress. So let's stop the automatic victim blaming that these parents don't think that their kids are important or cared more about their cell phone or their purse or whatever else it might be than their kid. And instead, let's have an open conversation and be willing to openly remind one another about how these tragedies can be avoided. And that is leaving something in the back seat. If you don't want to call it important, then how about leave an object that you can't go without in the back seat? I don't know, make up whatever semantics that you want. It all means the same thing as long as we aren't missing the point about what we're trying to prevent here. So If that individual, that parent had left, say, their briefcase or whatever else they needed for that meeting in the back seat, they would have had to retrieve it when they got to work and saw their child in the back seat. If you don't have anything like that that's extra for you going to work that you can put in the back seat, how about your left shoe? You don't need that to drive anyway. Take off your left shoe. I guarantee you, when you step out of the car without a shoe on, you're going to take notice and it's going to remind you. So let's put an end to some of uh, this content that completely misses the point of what we just talked about, and instead try to help each other prevent a tragedy whenever we can. So, heat fatalities, of course, aren't just results of leaving children in vehicles. They can happen for all sorts of different reasons. And there's been a recent adaptation of using wet bulb globe temperature in order to better assess heat risk and heat impacts on the human body. The wet bulb globe temperature is not anything new. It's actually been around since the 1950s. It was first put into use mostly by the military so that they were not overexerting uh, their recruits by engaging in drills during periods of excessive heat to the point where heat illness was becoming a problem. So it was actually put into place over 70 years ago, but it has only recently gained more traction among more communities. So things like athletic organizations and schools are beginning to adopt wet bulb globe temperature as a better means to assess heat risk on students and athletes and anybody that's exerting themselves outdoors in the summer heat. And while we're all used to seeing heat conveyed in terms of heat index, we're all very used to that. Wet bulb globe temperature is much less popular, which is unfortunate because wet bulb globe temperature has a lot of advantages over the heat index. The heat index that you are used to seeing as sort of the feels like temperature or that your body is sort of experiencing the equivalent of, it's only factoring in temperature and humidity. It is not incorporating anything about the winds or whether or not you are located in direct sun or not, or how much cloud cover there might be. So you can instantly see how advantageous something like the wet bulb globe temperature might be. I think that we've all had those days where maybe the heat index is 105 degrees, but if you're outside at, say, a park pavilion in the shade and there's a decent little breeze blowing, you can sit out there and enjoy a nice, refreshing beverage, and it actually doesn't feel that bad, despite the fact that the heat index is telling you that it should feel miserable at 105 degrees. Now, the wet bulb globe temperature is going to account for that because you're in the shade and you have that breeze, and the effects of those things are going to give you a better representation of the heat stress that is currently ongoing on your body. So, what does a wet bulb globe temperature look like? Well, 90 degrees is often used as a big threshold for when the heat really starts to become oppressive and result in heat-related illness. If you're in the upper 80s, obviously the heat can still take a toll, but 90 degrees is often a common threshold used for uh, when you really need to start taking extra precautions to avoid heat-related illness. And you can see on this chart here, this is actually from um, our office to the north, the Weather Service in Tulsa. And basically, once you are above a 90-degree wet bulb globe temperature, it's recommended that you exert yourself for really no more than 15 minutes in a 1 hour time period. You should spend at least 45 minutes of an hour resting and cooling yourself so that your body can manage that heat stress that it's undertaking from being outdoors. All right, so let's take a look at what wet bulb globe temperature is actually comprised of. So it is essentially a weighted average between three different types of temperature. So in this equation, we have the natural wet bulb temperature, which is incorporating the humidity factor of this. We have the dry bulb temperature, which is just the standard ambient air temperature we're all used to seeing. And we have the globe temperature, which we will talk a little bit more about here in just a couple of minutes. But this is essentially the formula for what the wet bulb globe temperature looks like. So the biggest components of this equation, as we can see, is the wet bulb temperature, which means humidity is still the biggest factor here. But there are some other elements that are making their way into this that are not incorporated into the heat index. And now you might be thinking, Matt, you just said on the last slide that winds were factored in here, and these are just three different temperatures. So what happened to that wind that we just talked about? Well, the wind is being accounted for in the globe temperature. And we'll talk more about globe temperature here in a second, which is really the driving force behind this. Um, the globe temperature can be estimated, and there's this paper that all of this is from that was actually done by the Weather Service in Tulsa as part of a collaborative effort. And we can actually estimate the globe temperature for forecast purposes, since we can't always directly measure it on site, especially not ahead of time, of course, in order to help to actually forecast what a wet bulb globe temperature might look like. So this is the type of device that, in this case, this is one that's handheld, that can actually measure wet bulb globe temperature. And we said that it was comprised of three different types of temperature, and you'll see three different types of sensors all across the top of this device. So on the right, we have a standard ambient air temperature thermometer, which is sheltered from the sun. The ambient air temperature should always be measured in the shade, and that's what this is designed to do, basically, is keep it well ventilated and also a reading of the air temperature that is in the shade. The middle sensor here with this wick is measuring the humidity or the wet bulb temperature and incorporating the factor of humidity. And the sensor on the left is the globe temperature sensor. So this black globe is what is taking into account the fact that you are in the sunlight, and it's also incorporating wind speed. And the way it's doing that is, so sunlight is hitting this black globe, which is acting as a black body and re-emitting radiation in all directions. Now, inside of this black globe is a separate thermometer, and it's measuring how much heat that this black globe is re-radiating to the interior. So it's getting the effect of just the sunlight and how much it is heating up this black globe. Now, if you have wind present, the wind is going to disperse the air immediately near this black globe temperature sensor and aid it in cooling the air around it, allowing it to more effectively radiate heat out back to the environment. And it will cause this black globe to cool slightly. So the effect of wind is there through the dispersion of heat immediately adjacent to the globe temperature sensor. So that is where the wind component of this is coming from. So this emulates the effect of wind that is moving past your body as it's moving past this black globe temperature sensor. So these kind of devices will give you an on-station report of what the wet bulb globe temperature is, which is fantastic. These are in use by not only the military, which is pictured here. This was a photo from over a decade ago, I believe, in Afghanistan, where this was being used. There are devices like this. You can go online and find all sorts of different ones, but they're in use by athletic organizations, especially at like the high school and college level, where they can get measurements of wet bulb globe temperature on the field and see how much heat stress that their athletes are actually experiencing. So now you will probably find that there are discrepancies between things like forecast values of wet bulb globe temperature and observed values of wet bulb globe temperature, simply because of how these kind of devices behave. A lot of not just these handheld types of devices, but even home weather stations tend to often overestimate humidity because of poor ventilation and air circulation, or the actual ambient temperature device might not be fully sheltered from the sun, and it might be exposed to some radiation elements, which is going to artificially inflate the temperature. So there's all sorts of different factors here. Also, if you're interested in the black globe temperature, if it's going to depend on how sheltered that this device is from the wind. So if you are standing and measuring this where the wind is to your back and you're blocking the effects of the wind on this black globe temperature sensor, you are eliminating the factor of wind speed that is supposed to be accounted for in the wet bulb globe temperature. So all things to think about if you are making use of one of these as an athletic director or something in that capacity. So again, the Weather Service in Tulsa has a really cool page that goes into more about the wet bulb globe temperature. And I'll put this link down below if you want to check it out too. And I would really encourage you to get on here and play around with this a little bit. So we talked about how the black globe temperature can't really be forecast. It's something that really only exists in an observational capacity. But through manipulating the thermal emissivity equation, we can actually come up with an estimate for what the black globe temperature should be, or at least within about half a degree or so, uh, in terms of a forecast using more traditional weather elements, things like wind and sky cover, in order to compare that to what an observed value of wet bulb globe temperature might be. So in order to do that, we'll also need the theoretical maximum solar radiation that we can have on a given day. So for that, we'll need, of course, the month and the day for the time of year, as well as the latitude that we're at. And we can calculate how much radiation we could be getting from the sun at any given time. And we can also make use of cloud cover and wind speed, and those elements together will allow us to estimate what the black globe temperature is. Of course, we also have our standard ambient air temperature and our humidity or dew point to factor in how much moisture is in the air. And through all of these things, we're able to calculate both a heat index and the wet bulb globe temperature. So in this example, this is pretty extreme. There's this cool little interface here where you can click on the map and it'll load in some recent data or forecast data for you. So we're just looking basically right in the middle of the DFW Metroplex here. So let's say on a day like today or the past couple days when the temperature is, as high as maybe like 102 or something, and our afternoon dew points are only mixing out to around 72 degrees. So it's still really humid out there. We're not getting that aggressive mixing into the 60s for dew points. In this type of situation, the heat index would be 113 degrees, which is quite exceptional. That's meeting excessive heat warning criteria for us here in the DFW area. But the wet bulb globe temperature is just barely right at that threshold for even being at its most oppressive level of 90 that we talked about before. So why do you think that that might be? Well, there's these other factors that aren't just temperature and humidity. We're actually carrying a bit of a light breeze here. It's not much, but it's 7 miles per hour. And we've got a little bit of sky cover around. There's 20% cloud cover. So how do you think that the wet bulb globe temperature might respond if instead of having a decent little breeze, what if it's a perfectly calm afternoon? And what happens if we lose those clouds that are out there and we don't have any sky cover? Well, you can actually take these sliders and adjust them. And if we get rid of the winds, we've now increased our wet bulb globe temperature up to 92, which is getting towards the level of extreme values for wet bulb globe temperature. I would say anything between about 92 and 94 is pretty much just absolutely miserable outside, and you just do not want to be physically exerting yourself outdoors if you don't absolutely have to. If you get up to a value of about 95, it's getting to basically unheard of levels for wet bulb globe temperature. So on a day where, let's say maybe we get to like 104 degrees and the dew point is 74, this would be like the most extreme possible case that you could have if you also had no wind and no cloud cover. So this would be essentially record levels of a heat index for the DFW area, which I believe is either 117 or 118 off the top of my head. And again, near record levels for wet bulb globe temperature, or at least near extreme values for wet bulb globe temperature. But in this case, what would happen if we actually had a decent breeze this day? What happens if we have a 12-mile-per-hour breeze? Um, well, we're actually able to shave off 3 degrees off the wet bulb globe temperature, which it's still not going to feel great outside by any means. I mean, it is 104 over 74. It's absolutely brutal. But the fact that uh, the wind speed is being factored in and the wet bulb globe temperature can account for that and the effects of heat dispersion around your body is a really important factor, and it gives wet bulb globe temperature a pretty sizable advantage over something like just the heat index. So you can actually find wet bulb globe temperature forecasts from us at the National Weather Service on our digital forecast display. So here is the forecast map for tomorrow. Granted, this is 1 p.m., so we're going to have a little bit of an underestimate for what these values are actually going to look like during, the 3 or 4 o'clock peak heating time period. But for Tuesday afternoon, we've got values 88 to 90. We'll probably have some spots that are easily exceeding 90. And you can see on this map that these threat levels, which is the color shading, extreme basically corresponds to any values that are meeting that threshold of 90 degrees like we talked about. Uh, a lot of other organizations are also making use of wet bulb globe temperature now to base their decisions on. One of those, for example, is the University Interscholastic League, which is based in Texas for determining uh, interscholastic athletic activities. And they actually use, so we're class 3 here for this part of Texas for the thresholds. And these are actually thresholds that they use to determine things like practice time and outdoor activities. So, for example, that 92 threshold that we talked about, there are actually no outdoor workouts of any kind even allowed from this organization. And there are other limits to practice time. Again, 90 degrees here, key threshold. And just moving on down the line for how long practices can be and how much exertion can occur outdoors, just to prevent any heat-related fatalities or illnesses among student athletes. So there are countless examples of where this has been adopted, and I think it's a great idea for schools and other organizations that have outdoor interests to be looking closer at wet bulb globe temperature, since it does such a much better job than just the heat index for heat stress on the human body. Now, I think there are some challenges to overcome with this, uh, especially sort of at a public level. So, wet bulb globe temperature doesn't exactly just roll off the tongue, despite the fact that I've had to say it like 30 times so far in this episode. Uh, so I don't really envision a scenario where it kind of comes up in casual conversations. You're not going to be at the grocery store checking out in line and say, "Hey, did you see the wet bulb globe temperature today? It's miserable out there." Like we do that with heat index. It's like 120 out there. It's terrible, yeah. But uh, for wet bulb globe temperature, I don't know that that's ever going to be the case. I think the biggest issue that wet bulb globe runs into is the fact that the values don't really sound that bad. A value of 90 degrees for any sort of temperature, it sounds great to me. Like 90 degrees, it's been 105 the past week, so I'll gladly take 90. That sounds fantastic, right? But on this type of scale, 90 is a really high end and oppressive value. So I don't know what the solution to that necessarily is, if it's sort of reframing this as some sort of index that it is maybe a little bit more friendly for public consumption. I don't know what the solution is, but I do hope that maybe this gets adopted in a little bit more widespread sense, because it is such a more useful metric than heat index in a lot of different ways. So while heat has been the main story for us over the course of the past several days, there actually have been a few areas that have managed to get a few showers and storms. Most recently, about a week ago in central Texas, as the result of a weak front that we had left over in the area. And it prompted a really good question. that we often get this time of year, and that had to do with what the radar was displaying in terms of hail size. So this question was, my radar is showing 1.5 inch hail over insert town here. This was asked a couple different occasions for a couple different towns. Do you all have any concerns with this storm? We didn't have a warning on it, but the radar was indicating 1.5 inch hail. And I just thought that was a great question. And it's something that we encounter pretty much every summer. And the way that radar displays estimated hail size can be very different depending on the source that you're using. Sometimes you have sort of a display that looks more like reflectivity sort of does, that's color coded differently for an estimated hail size. Other types of displays will either have a storm tracker with hail size information on it, or maybe an icon that's overlaid on reflectivity, something like that. So it can appear in various different ways depending on what kind of radar source that you are making use of. And these algorithms behave well sometimes. In the summertime is when they often struggle the most. And that has to do with the nature of how thunderstorms are behaving this time of year. So in the summer, we have the weakest shear out of pretty much any time of year. And we're all very familiar with sort of the stages of thunderstorm development where you have this updraft and this cumulonimbus cloud grows and develops. And the top of the cloud is all very cold and sub-freezing, and that's where you're getting most of your hail growth is in the top half of your thunderstorm. And that eventually it gets heavy and collapses to the ground through the downdraft. Now, uh, if you have some shear, like in the case of a springtime supercell, for example, you often get a much larger separation of the updraft and the downdraft from one another. So in this case, the area beneath the updraft in a more organized storm is often rain-free, and the downdraft is all occurring well outside of where the updraft is. So the downdraft is unimpeded, and all of the hail is falling there. Whereas in our previous image, um, the downdraft basically starts to occur um, and overtake where the updraft is beginning. So the thunderstorm is basically growing and then collapsing right upon itself in the summer because it doesn't have enough shear to sufficiently start to separate the updraft and downdraft from one another. This has massive implications on hail sizes and hail growth. So in a supercell environment like this, you're lofting the hailstone, it's able to stay suspended for a long period of time, and then it gets accelerated down to the ground through a very strong downdraft as well. If you have a single cell or ordinary cell thunderstorm in the summer, that's basically just collapsing on top of where the updraft is, that descent to the surface of a hailstone is going to be greatly delayed. So, an updraft speed of an ordinary cell thunderstorm is often not nearly as strong as a supercell. So, you can see here about what updraft speed is necessary to support different types of hailstones. And there's a lot of different factors that play into this. So, these measurements are only approximations. There's all sorts of different factors that can affect these speeds and result in hail sizes. But in the summer, it's very difficult to start getting updraft speeds that are any stronger than what you see on this particular chart here. A springtime supercell that is one of the most violent storms that you might see could have an updraft speed that is near or perhaps even exceeding 100 miles per hour. But that would only be in the most robust of supercell storms that you can get. In the summertime, these updraft speeds are much weaker, and while they can still support hail that is of severe limits of an inch or more, it's very hard to start getting updraft speeds that are higher than that. So it's taking 50 to 65 mile per hour winds essentially just to support large hail, even in the upper portion of a thunderstorm. Now, keep in mind where that hail is developing. It's all developing up miles above the ground, 3, 4, 5, even 6 miles above ground level at least. And uh, what do you think that the thermal uh, characteristics of the atmosphere look like in the summer? Well, the lowest 3 miles basically of the atmosphere are all above freezing, and the lowest mile of the atmosphere is all between 80 and 100 degrees on a summer afternoon. So on a hailstone's journey to the surface, it's undergoing a great deal of melting. It's colliding with other hailstones. It is colliding with warmer raindrops that are also above freezing. So, what do you think that that is going to do to an initial hailstone that is, say, a golf ball size or a quarter size? It's undergoing a ton of melting on its journey down to the surface. So, small hail will typically fall roughly between about 10 and 25 miles per hour because, again, all sorts of different factors at play here. Drag forces because of surrounding air, uh, and there's so many different factors that can go into that. But if small hail is only falling at 25 miles per hour, it's taking over 10 minutes for that to actually fall all the way to the surface through that near or above freezing air. So a vast majority of that has either totally or nearly completely melted by the time it gets there. Severe hail, same thing, 25 to 40 miles per hour. It's faster, but it's melting as it goes. And therefore, this is going to be a nonlinear process because as it's falling, it's melting, it's getting smaller, which means it's falling slower, which means it's spending more time in above freezing air, which means it's melting more, which means now it's falling even slower. And you can imagine that by the time that even golf ball hail gets all the way to the surface, it has undergone so much melting that oftentimes you just get a boatload of small hail, like dimes and peas, that are falling out of storms that you would otherwise think would be capable of severe hail. So, in order to illustrate an example of this, we're going to take a look at some storms from about a week ago in this episode's radar recap. For this week's radar recap, we'll be taking a look at some thunderstorms that occurred across central Texas back on the afternoon of August 9th. And nothing about the reflectivity here looks particularly menacing or anything. It looks like some pretty generic afternoon thunderstorms for the most part. So I do want to call attention to this storm here just southwest of Waco. And it's got this 2-inch hail icon on it. While the reflectivity down here at the surface, we're currently looking at zero point 0.5 degrees, doesn't look menacing by any means. What happens if we tilt up and see what's going on up in the hail growth zone of this storm? So maybe up around, say 20 to 30,000 feet. So we're going to tilt up in elevation. And now we see some higher reflectivities now that we are up at 15,000 feet here. And there are several distinct hail cores in this entire cluster of thunderstorms. Let's keep tilting up. And this storm that's right here near Lorena is definitely the strongest of the bunch. It has the tallest top. We are currently looking up at 36,000 feet. We have reflectivity values up to 56 dBz. And down here at nearly 30,000 feet above ground, we have some reflectivity values in excess of 60 dBz. Now, I really like using a 60 dBz reflectivity threshold at the minus 20 Celsius level for severe hail detection. It's served me well, and that's one thing that I really prefer to look at least as a first early assessment for hail size in a thunderstorm. So if you go and look at a sounding from this day, our minus 20 Celsius height was about 26,000 feet. So we are meeting that here by a couple thousand feet. And this hail core is being suspended aloft in the storm, despite the fact that if we go way down to the surface, our reflectivity overall looks fairly unimpressive. So if I walked in to the office and sat down and got ready to work radar on a spring afternoon, and this was the only image that I saw right here, I would say, uh-oh, and I would start drawing up a warning because more than likely there's enough shear involved in this storm because it would be an April afternoon and we are often very well sheared in the springtime that any reflectivity like this up at 30,000 feet is probably going to start being capable of producing severe hail. You're at least going to get some quarters out of that if that thunderstorm is exhibiting any degree of rotation and the environment is otherwise favorable for it. Now, if you told me that this was August and I saw that, I would do some further assessment. But overall, I'm not terribly concerned about hail size here. In fact, I'd be much more concerned about a wind threat than I would be a hail threat out of this cell. Down at the surface, if we go all the way back down to our lowest scan, we can already see this outflow boundary that is now rushing off of these storms to the south. So what might that tell you? Well, we've now cut off the inflow from these storms, and from this point onward, they are probably only going to trend downward in intensity. So if you issued a warning at this point for hail size, it's unlikely that that reflectivity core way up at 30,000 feet is going to intensify further in the near future. In fact, I would say that this storm is now over the hump and getting ready to enter its weakening stage as that collapses to the ground. Another thing that we notice here is that as we go up and down in the vertical, the highest reflectivity values are all located basically right on top of one another. They're all vertically stacked right on top of one another. So what does that mean for sort of that updraft and downdraft separation topic that we talked about earlier? Well, it really means that there isn't any. This storm is going to just collapse right on top of itself, right where its updraft was, and it's going to essentially just turn entirely into downdraft and collapse on this one particular spot. So all of this hail that is suspended up here at 30,000 feet is going to take 10, 15 minutes maybe to fall all the way to the surface as it's still fighting drag forces from air and some weak vertical motions that are still going to be left in the lower levels with the last vestiges of that updraft. And it's going to encounter warmer rain. It was 100 degrees in central Texas on this afternoon. It's going to undergo so much melting that hail is really the least of my concerns at this point, and I'm much more concerned about a localized microburst threat than I am with a hail threat out of a storm like this. Uh, now, shortly after this, actually, we had this question and we discussed it about how these hail algorithms can sometimes suffer from just using reflectivity. And we had someone actually come and report to us in the town of Hewitt that the storm had just passed over 10 minutes prior, that they actually got no hail whatsoever out of this cell. Now, that doesn't mean that it was necessarily in downdraft mode entirely at that time, but the fact that there was no hail whatsoever when the storm looked similar just 10 minutes previously tells me that I don't need to be drastically concerned that all of a sudden we're going to start getting golf ball hail falling out of this particular storm that has a lot of factors working against it. One thing that I would be looking at in this case from a wind standpoint, though, is what's called a mid-altitude radial convergence signature, or a MARC, M-A-R-C signature for short. And you would do that by looking at velocity. And we might do another episode just on MARC signatures at some point. But if I go up to like the middle portion of this storm, in order to assess where a microburst might be ongoing, we want to look for convergence. So that's um, basically these green inbound velocities meeting these red outbound velocities. So just because you have green versus red doesn't mean it's rotation. In this case, it's convergent because our radar is down here to the south. So our green shading up here is winds going from north to south. The red is going from south to north. So these are converging along this line where these colors meet, which is exactly where our thunderstorm is located. So if you want to assess a microburst threat, the first place to look is at the winds in the mid levels. And if you get this convergence occurring, that's an early sign that the storm is beginning to collapse and rush down towards the ground. Because if that storm is entirely descending, then it's pulling in air from the surrounding parts of the storm towards the center. Much like if you were sort of uh, standing on like a sidewalk and a big truck drives by, you can feel the air move inward to fill the vacant air behind the truck. That's essentially what's happening with the updraft. The air in the downdraft is now descending and it's got to be replaced from somewhere, and that somewhere is the side. So the air is coming together and converging. And that's what's happening here. So you can see this convergence occurring. Now, this typical or a typical value of a mark signature that I would be concerned with is close to like 30 knots worth of convergence. And in this case, we basically have maybe like 10 knots of inbounds and 5 or so knots of outbounds. So this is a very weak mark signature at this point. Not to mention, we talked about before how the storm has already been cut off down at the low levels from that outflow boundary that was situated to the south. So even from a wind standpoint, while I don't doubt that there's some gusty winds occurring beneath this storm, maybe 40, even 50 miles per hour, the ability to get a severe wind gust out of this is or the probability that that's going to occur is very low. Now, these hail algorithms can be very useful still, despite the fact that we didn't actually use it for hail. So, hail algorithms are useful in that they will very quickly show you where your strongest cores are aloft. And from there, you can go and do a little bit more thorough analysis. But this is one really great example of why you should never just use radar data in a vacuum without a background knowledge of the environment. We're going to briefly take a look at some of the weather that we can expect for the next week or 10 days or so to close out the month of August. And to do that, we're going to take a look at a single computer model, or at least a 4-panel of one. Last time we checked out a average of a 500 millibar chart. And this time we're just going to look at one particular model with some different fields on it that we're interested in today. So basically going from the top left, we are starting up at 250 millibars, or about 35,000 feet above ground level. So we will descend as we sort of work clockwise across these maps. So we're down at the 500 millibar level here, just a couple thousand feet above ground level at the 925 millibar level here, and our surface chart is going to be down in bottom left. So this is what we're looking at for basically current conditions, or what the model thinks that we're starting off with. So if we go to the 500 millibar chart up in the top right, we can see that very strong area of high pressure, that upper ridge axis that's just completely dominating the southern and central plains, which is why it's been 100 plus degrees for the past couple days and why it still is today. Across the north east portions of the country, though, they're actually in an upper trough pattern, and it's been kind of rainy. There's some precip that the model is generating for today, and lots of cloud cover, and this front that basically sags all the way from the New England states into the southeast portion of the country, and even into portions of the Midwest. So as we go forward in time here, we can look at how this might evolve heading into Wednesday. That 500 millibar ridge stays anchored pretty strongly across the southwest. It might have retreated a little bit to the west, but by and large, it's still the main factor for our weather locally here in Texas. Now, one thing that you do notice is this very strong area of surface high pressure that's associated with this trailing area behind the departing upper low across the northeast. And this frontal boundary has kind of almost pushed into North Texas from the east. So this is often referred to as a backdoor cold front, where a standard cold front usually just kind of comes plowing in from the northwest, like we get during the late fall and the winter time. In the summer, it's much more common to sort of get these backdoor fronts where they just kind of barely nudge in from the east in these exact types of setups. Now, this might at most sort of veer our winds to easterly while ushering in maybe some slightly cooler temperatures by a couple degrees through the middle portion of the week. But it's going to be difficult for a feature that's this weak to really have any noticeable difference on our sensible weather. Our highs are still going to be in either the upper 90s or uh, the lower hundreds up to like 105 out west still. So it's really not going to offer us a whole lot of relief for most of the area. Now, for people up in the Ohio Valley region, even parts of the Midwest, if you've got some family up there, this would be a great time to pay them a visit because they're looking at highs probably in the 70s, maybe even 60s as you get up into parts of like Pennsylvania and New York. So this big upper low and its cold front that it brought down into the southern plains is a big relief for them. A nice break for mid-August. Unfortunately, they get the low, and we are stuck with the high down here in the Southern Plains. So by the end of the week, that high builds right back in and basically engulfs North Texas again. And it's just going to stay anchored over the Southern Plains while another trough develops off to the Pacific Northwest, basically. And that jet stream is going to cause it to track across the far northern portions of the country, up through the Dakotas, well north of anywhere where it's going to be of any influence to us. We're going to stay right beneath this ridge axis with hot and dry and subsident weather all the way through the end of the week. Now, that same shortwave trough at 500 millibars does look like it wants to kind of take a chunk out of the ridge, and it's actually uh, fairly strong. Is going to bring some shower and thunderstorm activity to parts of the central and northern plains by late in the week and over the upcoming weekend. But again, we've got such a strong ridge of high pressure to work with here locally that it's not going to be able to come anywhere close to North Texas. One thing that this particular model run wants to do is develop a weak mid-level low pressure circulation across the western Gulf. And we'll have to see how much, if any, that might try to steer some additional moisture content onshore and up into maybe parts of east or central Texas. If nothing else, you could get a little bit of cloud cover from that, while most of the rain would probably stay down along the coast in this type of scenario. But you never know. Sometimes you can get a sea breeze feature that's able to actually advance farther northward and bring some leftover shower and thunderstorm activity into some of our central Texas counties, at least. So, something to at least keep an eye on as we head into next weekend. But even heading into next week, so this is 7 or 8 days out into the future, this ridge axis still looks very strong. It's engulfing most of the US. So it's just a reminder that summer is not done, and we've got a ways to go before we break down the summertime ridge axis at 500 millibars and start getting into more active weather. For us here in Texas, it's usually about mid to late September when we start to get the much more noticeable cold fronts this far south. And we will have to see, hopefully by the next episode, we'll have maybe some cooler weather and some rain chances maybe to talk about. So don't forget to send us your questions for the Q&A segment. And don't forget to subscribe so that you can be alerted for the next episode as well. The links to pretty much everything that I talked about are in the description, so be sure to check more of those out, especially about wet bulb globe temperature. Go check out that calculator and experiment with what the wet bulb globe temperatures are looking like the rest of this week while we stay just pretty much miserably hot and dry for the next week to 10 days as we close out the month of August. That's all from us. Stay safe, stay cool. We'll see you next time, and hopefully we'll have some cooler weather to chat about.